Well, welcome. Good morning, everyone. If you're in Africa or Europe, to those listeners in Australia, I guess it's good afternoon, and maybe we have some in New Zealand. It's good evening. Love to have everyone back. A big attendance tonight, and I'll introduce our speaker in a moment. That's Keith Kenyon. But before I do, I want to talk about what's coming up next week. I'll just cover that first. We've got Professor Spike McCarthy from Johannesburg talking about structural control on gold deposits in the Wits. And we've also got Graham Gavin, you just talked about, you just heard him speak a moment ago, also on the Wits, followed by, and that's Tuesday and Thursday, and then we'll wrap up the whole 4 or 5 weeks later on Thursday the 17th. And if you want to send questions and things beforehand, most welcome. I've put together a few things talking to others that I'm just going to run through now as just thoughts coming out of the first half dozen talks we've had. Dave Craw had a throwaway line saying, well, is the Wits really a foreland basin? That made me listen. I don't know the answer. We've got that issue of channels and channels and channels. Everyone's using the word, and they're clearly very different, the way it's being used by different people. Erosion channels, grade plane channels, and then other people, anticlinal channels and pay-shoot channels, but I won't go into those further, but just to raise the point that we've got a terminology issue there. We talked a bit earlier, 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the famous basal reef sample. It was cut in half. Gordon Cole knows a lot about that. So does Jonathan Law, who've been contributing. And basically, we've got two groups studying the different halves, and they get completely different answers. Again, I'm not going to try and explain that right now, but that's something that stuck out. With the metamorphic fluids, we've got forming gold fluid, that's a gold-rich fluid, from scratch, not forming a fluid and then sending it off somewhere else to go and collect its gold. So a new way to look at fluids there. I think Julian Verncombe emphasised around the time of John Clemens' talk, and John sort of highlighted it too, the importance of introducing things like igneous and metamorphic petrology knowledge rather than just treating ourselves as economic geologists and not bothering about the expertise available outside. And I guess the key thing from last week was, the week before, was don't leap to magmatic processes to answer every ore deposit. They can't enrich every element. And then finally, Bjorn van der Haven's talk covering a large part of Africa, actually, and its gold deposits. And the one thing I picked out there, and he didn't explain it exactly this way, but the question was, where would you go and find another one of these somewhere in Africa, ideally in South Africa? And what would you send out your team to look for? Would you talk about pebble size, pebble roundness, pyrite, fluvial setting, or maybe you'd talk about unconformity structures, carbon or iron-bearing detritus? So those are some of the things that came out of the various speakers and the chat in between Thursday lectures. It's my pleasure to introduce Keith Kenyon today. Very much fits in the theme of those. Maybe he'll answer some of those questions that I've thrown up there. I'm not going to go into his bio in detail because you had that sent out by Henny during the week. He's a geochemist. He's been involved in exploration. He's been involved in research for quite a long time with Anglo-American and Anglo-Vaal. He's got vast knowledge of different ore deposit types and countries around the world. But as far as I'm concerned, his expertise and the side we're going to hear tonight is on the Witwatersrand. And there's few people who will have analysed more minerals, rocks, seen an awful lot than Keith. And Keith, we're delighted that you've sort of got this talk together and going to show us some things that will be new and interesting. So Keith Kenyon, please take over.
Thank you, Neil. Right, this is the difficult bit. Okay, can you cut? Can we try again?
Just unshare, Neil. Carry on, Keith.
All right. I just need to click. I've lost the screen, as would happen.
We can see it.
Can you see my? Is it
Yes.
clear?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Can I proceed?
Yes.
Well, what I want to talk about is my view of the Witwatersrand deposits. I'd like to thank Neil for his kind comments. And yes, I probably have sampled more borehole core than most people. But working for a large corporation always reduces the focus on anything like this. And there is so much that I'm sitting on that has never been completed. And this is essentially going to be the background to a lot of what I got to say. It's moving into the story, then out of the story, into the story. And this has happened over 40 years. And it's getting to the point now of my life where this stuff needs to be put together. I need to sit with Neil in particular next time he comes to Stellenbosch and start putting this stuff down on paper, because really I've never written a thing since the 1997 paper that went into has been published, and this stuff should be written up. But as far as I'm concerned, and Neil pointed out with his slides, in my view, that there's a never-ending search for the mysterious mineralization model. But before we get into it, I'd just like to give it a bit of history as to what my background is. I joined Anglo American Research Laboratories in July the 1st, 1971. That's 54 years ago. So I've seen a half a century of the Wits Basin. And my first project, which was started a few months after starting my career, was a project entitled Gold Glosses Underground. And I was given my first experience of working underground in those conditions. And it's something that stuck with me my entire life. I've done a lot of work underground, and I'm always amazingly respectful for the geologists who spend a lot of time down there mapping. And one of the things I believe that has always hindered the good academic work that's come out of the Wits over the years, the fact that visiting academics are always given limited access to sample underground for safety reasons, for time reasons, and they never ever had the exposure that we had. Our problem was always we didn't have the time to finish the work. So we always had these issues. So at some stage, the two sides need to get together and sort out their joint collections of vast amounts of information and try and review everything. I've been thinking towards having another conference at some stage, just on the Wits, where both sides of the argument are resolved or spoken about with a view to resolving them. Because I'm of the opinion, and coming out as I talk, that there may be something we're missing. And that is the bit that I'd like to address right at the end. But what we did, why I'm going into this is that it brought about my interest in understanding how the gold got there, was that we did a lot of sampling underground. We discovered that the gold was being liberated in the carbon seam reefs almost on blasting. And this was a big issue in my life. And why was this happening? At that stage, I didn't understand what was going on, and everybody thought it was a placer. But when we started looking at the stuff under the microscope, we noticed the particles were always in carbon. Yet the grade control data showed that the ore was right across the mine face, and that didn't sit with me, particularly when between 50 and 40% the gold was liberated in blasting, and the thicker and the more developed the carbon seam, the more gold was liberated and lost. So we had this thing called the mine core factor. But this working environment was notoriously unpleasant. And to actually do sampling and to do anything properly was extremely dangerous. In fact, I've still got a scar on my back where in the study to look at the gold glosses underground, we had to use one of these jackhammers to actually pull out the footwall. And because the stress is down there, the rock didn't just come out the ground and break. It actually shot out the ground, and I got hit in the back. Fortunately, it was just superficial scarring damage by a piece of rock. So the environment is not pleasant to do any kind of sampling. And so we, as I say, we dealt with this mine core factor problem. And for those who don't know about the mine core factor, it's essentially a figure that they use for accounting. It's essentially the amount of metal produced in recovery plus the residues over the metal called for by evaluation as a percentage. And when we looked at it, we found that there was a whole lot of reasons of why the gold was being lost, and there were various factors. One was the gold distribution and gold association of the reef prior to mining. It is limited to a carbon seam mainly. but no one believed us. The effect of mining on the carbon seam was a big problem. How they laid their charges relative to the carbon seam. And I'm talking mainly about carbon seam mines now. On mines like where there's a VCR, where the gold is more distributed throughout the reef, the issue wasn't as big a problem. But you had gold particle liberation and blasting. We had gold dispersion and mining. They lost it on tramming. They lost it in hoisting. For instance, the shaft sludge at the bottom of the shafts, which was very rarely collected, was running at mine grade. There was an ore body down at the bottom of the shafts. Loss in conveyor belts, loss in the plant, gold lost to waste. And then the mine laboratories were inadequate. And in 2002, as I was approaching retirement, 4 years later, we managed to arrange with the executive at AngloGold to close down the mine labs and hand the work over to SGS, a commercial laboratory. Because what we found with the mine labs, the Vaal Reef lab, we sent in some 40 samples for assay. And the average grade we got back, they were blanks. They were Malmoni dolomite blanks. And the samples we got, the data we got back was the average grade of these blanks was 9 grams a ton. I then went in and audited the lab, and part of my job as chief geochemist was auditing labs. I've done about 300 around the world, and that's from beginning to end. Every instrument, everything, the way they do things is audited. And this place was just a mess. And this is what had been assaying our gold for years and years and years and years. Some of the equipment in those labs hadn't been replaced for 50 years. And that was just unacceptable. So we had all these problems. And of course, they're incorrect bulk density measurement. But these aren't really anything to do with the origin of gold. But what I'm showing this is to show the sort of background that I came from. And we go back underground today, you will still find and you can't go in those areas because they've been closed up because there is closure underground where the footwall comes up and just closes up the old stope. But that's material that's left behind after mining. That's got grade in it. And it was just tardy cleaning, tardy chamming. There is a lot to be, these zamas that are working underground, this is the stuff they're pulling out. So what we're really talking about today, though, is the legacy data that I have. And all of us, people like Grant, Spike, all of us are sitting on legacy data in our files. In my case, it's stuff that I knew that AngloGold was going to abandon South Africa. I took away a lot of my data with me. I don't feel ashamed that I did it, because if you ask me where the data is now, I can't tell you. But the geological data collected by those large mining houses, it was mostly the 20th century, is a resource of immense value. They had the technology, even though it's not as good as today's technology, but their technology was able to collect a volume of data that cannot be collected today. This includes all geological data, and that's borehole data. Those deep boreholes, many of them, the core sheds have been abandoned with boreholes in that were drilled to 3 kilometer depth. That borehole is a source of all kinds of information on the Wits Basin. That's gone. As more and more technology develops, as more spectral technology develops, one could re-log that core using modern technology, but it's gone. It's disappeared. As I explained to someone earlier, I was up at the Council of Geoscience where they told me they found all the boreholes abandoned in the field that American AngloGold drilled in the Evander project that we did in the 80s and the 90s. It was just abandoned in the field, but they've managed to collect those boreholes, and they are likely going back into Council of Geoscience as a core yard. But there's geophysical data, there's seismic data. Now, a lot of that seismic data has been handed to Wits. But there was deep seismic data which is handed to somebody, and we don't know where it is. We can't find it. We only kept the upper 4 seconds of two-way time. Everything underneath was given, and that is data that can be used to somebody, and it's now gone. And then there's all the geochemical data, much of which I've got on my computer. And there doesn't appear to be a formalized and coordinated effort to assemble and chronicle and store this legacy data. And I've been up at the council, and I've made initial approaches to them, and I'm working on it still, so that this data can be easily accessible and identified, that any university or academic that wants data can go there without any problems at all, and nobody's territorial about the data. It is South Africa's data, and it's important, and there's a vast history of data. And as many boreholes as possible could be stored at the CSG as things stand now, because they told me they've only got a quarter of their core yard used. So we can store data, and more, it can be arranged and more can be built. And we need to locate the surviving geologists, most of whom are retired. And again, it's people like Spike and Grant, who worked in major projects because they know where a lot of the stuff is as well, and a lot of their data, and so it's all in one place, and it doesn't have to be looked for. I mean, what I've got is a huge amount on my cupboards in my office. And these are the examples of what I've got. This is 50 years of data that's collected. I've got geochemical data sets, both deep bore and underground sampling, that were collected from one of the first multi-element XRF WDS, that's energy dispersive wide wavelength dispersive X-ray instruments that was ever built. It was 36 element analysis. The data that was produced here required a special kind of statistical understanding to clean the data up, because there were a lot of negative numbers and a lot of interference, which today on the modern instruments you don't get. But I'm sitting with unprocessed 36 element data, which was collected in 1980. It's probably in the order of 20 to 25,000 borehole samples alone. Much of it is unprocessed, but also there is processed data, which includes a lava database, which is used for fingerprinting, downhole fingerprinting, mostly Kanya and Ventersdorp volcanics. Is the Witwatersrand shale database of all the Witwatersrand, I think, and some Transvaal and various other shales around the basin. Then there was the Western Deep Levels Dike database, which was a rock mechanics database. Unfortunately, I thought I had it, but it's been lost. It's a tremendously useful database, but I cannot find it, and I'm busy trying to hunt it down. And then there are all the reef databases, which I've got quite a lot of. The projects like the PotchGap Geochem database. Of the XRF data that I've got, about 90% has been evaluated. But there's a huge amount in an archive somewhere that I would guess another 3 times as much, 4 times as much. And the Anglo-American Research Laboratories anniversary volume says they analyzed over 1 million samples on that instrument. Where that data is, I don't know. It's tremendously useful data. I'll show you some of the plots I did with it just now. And there's contemporary geochemical data. That Vaal Reef geochemical study was a very specialized study. I'll talk about it. That's contemporary ICP-OES EMS geochem data, at which there are rare earth elements, good rare earth element analyses, and platinum group element analyses. Then there are all the academic data sets which were done for us by Leeds University, by CSIRO in Australia. That data has never been published. And then there's, of course, the electron microprobe data. That, remember that Anglo Research Laboratories had probably the most productive electron microprobe that ever existed. It was used by De Beers. We estimate between 5 and 7 million mineral grain analyses were done by that instrument, and they were accurate. They were well done. They were well managed. And that was over a period of about, I don't know, I think it was about 30 years that instrument was used for. It had 9 spectrometers, of which 3 were, I think it was 9 spectrometers, of which 3 or 6 were for specific elements, and then 3 were scanning. And then there's a petrographic and polystone section database that I've got. I've got a cupboard full of thin sections, between 200 and 300, but they're chaotic. It needs me to go through them. And I can do that because at the bottom you'll see I've got all my field notebooks. And all the reports that we wrote, most of them are sitting somewhere in a data bank in the old Anglo-American Research Laboratory. So that's quite important. So, and all the sampling data. Anyway, what we're talking about is the WITS origin of the gold. There's really 2 sides. The modified placer, which is uranium gold, were first deposited as placers, which are later overprinted and remobilized over short distances by hydrothermal fluids. Lawrence Robb and Meyer and various Frimmel has done a lot of work on this. Those believe essentially it's modified. On the other side is Neil and Barnicoat and my group.
This guy that's presenting today came to me.
There's a voice in there. Please. The hydrothermal model proposed that gold and uranium were transported by and precipitated by hydrothermal fluids. And of course, these 2 arguments have stood and fought with each other over years, and before even our day, this argument went on back into the 30s. But the point is, it's never been resolved. And the big issue is the modified placer. The problems with it include a lack of suitable gold source, and this applies to both models actually. Chemically difficult to explain the remobilization and deposition over such short distances. No textual evidence of detrital gold, and an extraordinary long period deposition postulated. You've got equivalent reefs from the Dominion to the Black Reef. That's about 500 million years. That's a long time to have the same hinterland providing that gold, if it's a placer. And then the hydrothermal model, again, there's a lack of a suitable gold source. We've had people like Sebastian Fuchs give suggestions, and the guys at Codes at Tasmania. But again, I'm not too sure if the heating source is suitable for that kind of amount of gold. And I'll show you photomicrographs where I have problems with what's going on here. And then sedimentary features and textures that suggest sedimentary origin. The other day, Spike answered, he said, but yes, it's associated with conglomerate. That's not the first time I've heard Spike use that argument, and it's a very valid argument. The rocks are sedimentary, and they're always conglomerates, or mostly conglomerates. The other bit is from my observation. I will argue that there are few hydrothermal alteration minerals close to, spatially close to, the mineralized portions of the reef. And some of the geochem I've got seems to validate that. No evidence of boiling. Really, the vein systems I've seen around the world don't look like this. This is a bit different. I'll show you why, again, spectrographic. And I'm worried that the alteration that we see, which is copious, and Neil has done superb work on this, is actually related to the gold. Is it got anything to do with the gold itself? And that is something that has worried me. I'm quite happy with all the ideas about the alteration. This is a bit that I argued with Leeds as well. Is it actually part of the gold system? And where did the gold come from? This is a paper by Ross Large and company in 2013, where they looked for evidence of an intrabasinal source and multiple concentration processes. They did a lot of laser ablation ICP work and on the carbon leader, and they found that a significant portion of pyrite in the gold was intrabasinal and was derived from Westbrand Group or equivalent shale stratigraphically below this reef. They also found that isotope determinations found that in the cores of pyrite, they found ages which are Wits age 2750 and 2950 with hydrothermal overgrowth originating around Vredefort time. I found that was quite an interesting little discovery, because I have a feeling that Vredefort has a bigger role, and I'll get towards it later, to play in this whole story. And the study suggested that both of the two competing theories, the origin of the Witwatersrand gold reefs, are likely to be correct, which I found very interesting. It's a bit like taking the middle ground. But my point is, and this is the slide, I took data from a paper by Neil, and I cannot for life of me remember which one it's got. But all I wanted to show is the amount of gold that's been come out of its basin is more than comes out of the rest of the big gold mines in the world. And my problem is, where did all that gold come from? I don't think the Wits Basin has it in, and I'll show you why I don't think. I've got a huge database, and this is the old data. So you need to understand that the gold assays were done before we had techniques where we could go down satisfactorily below 0.1 gram a ton. I've taken this data and I've used a cutoff. In other words, I'm looking for the relationship of alteration what I was looking for is to try and determine whether the sediments could actually be a source for that gold. In other words, could you take 5 kilometers of sediment, as is a Vredefort group, and concentrate it into a little layer a few millimeters thick by scavenging out these values of what this would be the composition of this unmineralized sediments. I used the 1 gram a ton cutoff and a 0.55 gram a ton cutoff of all the gold in my database. And the bulk of the samples at that level, is that the grade, 0.16. And then another newer set of data found that we looked at the alteration, and this is a plot of rubidium, potassium, silica, and aluminium, which relates to the cerussite and the pyrophyllite that is associated with alteration. The mean grade is 8 ppb in that series of sediments. That's an extremely low gold level. That is about the level of any gold sedimentary basin in the world. Is that really, in other words, the unmineralized sediments are in most cases very low in gold. Is that really a source for gold with that amount of gold? That's all I'm asking. But what happened was we did a basin analysis study in Anglo. It was an act of huge bravery by the consulting geologist because the company model was the Placer. So in 1991, 92, 93, they set up the basin analysis project, and it was managed by a guy, Steve Lawrence, who came from a consultancy called Quad Consultancy, which ultimately morphed into the current RPS group, which are big engineering, oil industry engineering consultants. And Steve is an oil geologist, and he managed this project. And along with Tony Niles, they also brought in Andy Barnicoat and his team at Leeds University. And one important point in all of this is this statement came out of a paper by Jonathan Law Neal, was for the whole 300-kilometer length around this basin margin from Welcome to Evander, the maximum metamorphic temperature of the Central Rand group was consistently between 300 and 400 degrees. So that genetic model that's on the right-hand side is what is an average of all the, they did dozens of these genetic models. Each reef, I'm not going to go into each one. They clearly identify that gold is precipitated from hydrothermal fluids, challenges along zones of deformation. And the reefs recorded a complex history that may be simplified into 4 stages. Diagenesis, phylolytic deformation, which is actually forming of the structures that opened up where the fluids could get in, and then there was a mineralization event, and there was post-mineralization. As you can see, quartz was deposited both detritically, but also there's been a lot of movement around, and the quartz and the mineralization stage, it's fairly clear that the reefs are highly silicified, as can be seen from this bit here. These are the sulfidization events. There are 4 of them. Of course, this green area here, this is the formation, the alteration minerals, porphyrite, chlorite, white mica, and chloritoid. In my view, of all these minerals, the thing I see the most, all these other minerals, the alteration mineral that I see associated with gold most is chlorite. And I'll show you pictures of it in a minute. Then there's the gold, which is there. But notice the sequence is uraninite first, hydrocarbon second, gold third. That's very important. And then we have more examples of post mineralization. But much of this is not uraninite in my view. This is minerals like granite and secondary uraniferous rutile. Okay, but I want to look at this alteration a bit closer. And my question is, and I'm still not certain if we can actually resolve it, is the alteration we see related to the movement and precipitation of the gold? And is the geometry of the ore body compared to the extent of alteration rational, if you relate all this alteration to the gold? And the section I use is this section here. This has to be looked at fairly closely. The original section was we used semi-quantitative X-ray powder diffraction to identify the alteration minerals. But we later used the downhole PEMER as well. What we have here is a section. This is a Wits basin. The section runs from here close to the southeastern margin of the basin up to the north to east of Johannesburg. And what we have here on this side, we have a borehole that goes down to 3,250 meters. And this is the sort of depth of the basin coming this way. And what we found was different zones. These dark blue zones are where you get pyrophyllite only. The pink zones are where you get pyrophyllite and chloritoid. And the dark pink zones are where you get chloritoid only. And then you've got these massive zones where we get muscovite and chlorite. And then we have the zones where we have albertization, mainly in the Krugertalk formation, has a lot of albite in. So we've got these various zones. My problem is these are the ore bodies, and many of them are very, very thin. I don't understand why that this and this can actually be related. Are these two, or is the mineralization taking place while alteration, in other words, at the temperatures that we have with alterations taking place, or it's taking place at some other time where the source is actually a very much higher temperature. And I'm going to show you why I think that in a while. But this is what the ore body looks like. So you've got 3 kilometers of alteration with an ore body that's less than a millimeter thick. That is the carbonate seam. And these are the grades for samples along this section. From the one side of this photograph to the other side of the photograph is 5 millimeters. That ore body, the sample, we didn't just sample the carbon seam. The ore body is about, the samples are a little bit wider than the height of these photographs. But these are the grades we got out of it. hugely rich in gold. And these are the bits that I don't understand. How can that be related to alteration? The other thing is the fracture system. This yellow line is approximation. You can see the change in grain size across it. Relates to a stratigraphic boundary. And this thing cuts straight across it. But look at this quartz grain. This has gone straight through the quartz grain. And that's where the problem lies. These carbon seams just go straight through grains. They don't actually care about the grain. They tear pebbles to pieces. Anyway, this is the temperature estimates that Neil had in the Wits. As you can see, around the edge of the basin, about 300 degrees, and they increase towards Vredefort, which they actually estimated. But the point that they made is the lateral gradient is about 5 degrees per 100 kilometers, whereas the vertical grade was about greater than 35 degrees per kilometer. Sorry, 550 degrees per 100 kilometers, whereas the vertical was 35 degrees per kilometer. So there's a greater increase in temperature upwards. And again, I wonder whether this is not related to Vredefort. But the minerals that I was most fascinated with was the pyrophyllite and the chlorotoid, because that's what I have always believed are the most important part of this basin-wide alteration system. And it's quite important to notice that this pyrophyllite always reacts with the tidal force and starts dissolving it. It always embayed. There's the chlorotoid that's associated, but the association generally occurs in this part of the 5-phase diagram, again about 300 to 400 degrees, but the pressures can be anywhere between 1 and 10 kilobars. But the point is, this chlorotoid is an amazing substance because it occurs throughout the Wits. Yeah, it's subparallel in the green bar. Yeah, it's randomly orientated, but it's within one single pyrite pebble. And look at it, it's a bit like I call this the hedgehog grain, because the grains come out of the grain, the pyrite. Now, one interesting thing is pyrite as a mineral in some hydrothermal systems has got huge crystallization energy, so it often pushes all the other minerals aside and will form a cube. But it appears to me that this pyrophyllite doesn't care about this. Passes, in this case, this is the carbonita, passes straight through. But again, you've got to look at the textures on the microscope. And I prefer using a microscope than the scanning microscope, but you can't see it in there. But you see this gold is coming out inside as the vein, but has actually started corroding this. So it's later than the pyrophyllite. That's the other problem I have. The gold is later than the pyrophyllite. Yeah. The gold-bearing solutions, which these gray areas are granuritic and rutile, they also corrode the pyrophyllite. Here we have another example from the carbonita. This is gold with rutile. This is a ring of quartz, and this is the chlorotoid. In other words, the gold-bearing fluid is highly corrosive. This is not the only thing it reacts with. I'll show you other things. Those are about rock geochemistry, assisting the understanding of alteration. These again is the old data that are collected, not the modern data. This is from the Potts cap. What we've plotted here is strontium against potassium as an artifact of sericitization. And the colors of the points relate to gold. So the red color is the highest grade of gold. But we notice that the highest gold grades are always where the lowest potassium and strontium are. Here, rubidium and aluminium, again, the same thing. This is for the bird formation. The highest gold grades are always where the lowest, in other words, alteration is lowest. And from my point of view, if you're asking what is associated with the mineralization, as what alteration, I will say silicification. Because if you look particularly at the VCR, where it is at its best, these reefs, they have been silicified. And here is another example. This is the main reef. Here, interestingly enough, we have two trends. And the upper trend is where the gold is associated with. But again, it tends towards the lower end of the potassium content of the sedimentary rocks. The Livingston Formation is not so clear. It shows a single trend, but the gold seems to be distributed throughout it. But the gold grades of the Livingston are not very high. And one needs to look at why they're not high in the Livingston and why they like it relative to a mineralized carbonita. Those are things that need to be looked at. And where's the gold located? In these reefs. For most of my career, and while I was at Anglo Research Labs, I was told by everybody, including the resource geologists, the gold was dispersed across the entire mining width. Other people knew it was different. So what we did was, and this was an exercise of great strategic importance in the South African mining industry, to convince a mine manager to take a slab of rock weighing half a ton out of a gold mine up the shaft and carefully handle it was a major undertaking. What our problem was that the conventional sampling, which is something schematically shown here, is this orange area is what they're supposed to sample, and the yellow area is what's taken, if they're lucky. Most of it falls on the floor and is scattered all over the place. The black area is what's left behind, and it's often the carbon seam. So when they go and assay it, they assay it minus the carbon seam. So what we did is we took these up and we made thin sections across the mining width. And these are the thin sections. These aren't normal thin sections. These are polished thin sections. They're very expensive to make. They're not the cheapest in the world. And I'm going to hold it up to the camera. They're that size. This is the carbon leadless thin section I showed you earlier. These were taken across there, and we put students and some of our younger mineralogists mapping the gold out. And this is what they found. This is the thin section I've just shown you. Here's the carbon seam. These are the grades again. Same as I showed you earlier. The samples that were taken from this area run at this grade. That is the gold, carbon, and a little specks of uraninite. Here in this particular picture here, there's the carbon seam. Sometimes the seam splits. It splits wide. That might be wider or narrower, but that is the carbon seam. I want particular attention to be paid to this fracture that runs back. We're going to come back to it in a while. But what we discovered is that 90 to 98% of the gold occurs in the carbon seam, and then small scatterings occur outside it, and then they get less and less, but only for a couple of centimeters away from the reef. It's rare that you find gold away too far away from the reef. The gold is always close by. Now, the size of those circles, the smaller ones are 10 gold grains inside them, and the bigger ones are more than 10 gold grains, generally about 20 to 25. But then we looked at more than that. We did a study on the carbon. And there's a paper by Gary Gray and Steve Lawrence, myself, and Chris Cornford on understanding the gold. And what we did was we did reflectivity measurements like they do in the coal industry and like they do in the oil industry to determine the source of the gold, which we discovered comes from the consultants we had who were oil industry experts were satisfied that the shales, the Central Rand Group shales, were quite able to provide the carbon. But there's a sequence of events here which is quite clear. There's the carbon the uraninite forms. Then what happens is the carbon comes in and you have these pull open textures. But you notice there's like a fibrous orientation perpendicular to the plane of the carbon seam, which runs in this direction. Well, that is optically coherent. And we can measure bioreflectance, maximum reflectivity and minimum reflectivity. And from this, we can determine the source of the carbon. I'm not going to go into that paper in detail. It's very complicated stuff. But the point is the carbon is crystallographically orientated. There's the uraninite. The next thing is, here is another example of it. There's the carbon. But notice these white specks in the uraninite. That is radiogenic lead. But much of it is galena. And this, unfortunately, Clive did not do sulfur analyses, but he tells me that they didn't do them in the probe because there was no sulfur. But this is Clive Feather's 1976 paper. We're going to come back to this. He did an enormous, volume 2 is about 200 pages long. It's just electron microprobe analysis. Very good data, which people need to go back to. Instead of redoing the work all over again, there's a lot of data because he had access to samples which we're never going to have access to again. And that thesis is extremely important. I have a copy here in my office. But look at the gold pyrite association in terms of what the pyrite looks like. Earlier, in this particular case, notice that this pyrite has got crystallographic shape. The gold has inclusions in it. Here we have rounded pyrite with overgrowth, and the gold is outside the grains. These are numerous examples of this. But this is my favorite section. This is from the basal reef. Here we have rounded pyrite. There's no occlusions of gold in them. But we have this squeezed. You can see it's like oil. It has squeezed. That's why we call it mesophase. We don't call it kerogen. And you see it's globules. And in between the globules are the gold particles. But this is quite corrosive because look what it's done to the grain boundaries of this pyrite. And then we have this so-called, this gold veining is a fascinating phenomenon to me. What we've got there is gold with no evidence of anything else being with it. This gold is not reacted with the edges of the grain. The hydrothermal fluids that brought in there just precipitated the gold. No, I have a different view on this. And therefore, I want to look at the significance of carbon and pyrrhotite. In the plane of the carbon seams, as I showed you earlier, we've got pyrrhotite. At the top of this photograph is the carbon seam. Then we have pyrrhotite. But look at this. This is pyrrhotite. It's always formed like this. There's the pyrite. But look at this. This is a gold vein. And notice it's spotty. Oh, sorry, do you notice it's spotty? Well, that spottiness is associated with your polished pyrite that's been heated. It polishes in a spotty manner. That vein was hot. And that is a single vein. There's no evidence of anything else being with the gold. If that gold was coming in with a hydrothermal fluid, there'd be some other evidence. There's no evidence of anything else but just gold. Now, how did that get in there? It came along a fracture. It's not like it's gone along some kind of orientated structure. It's a proper 100% gold vein. There are many of these. And that's what happens when you look at a lot of polished sections. You start going mad. You see things which just don't make sense. Here's another example. Now, this is the VCR where there's no carbon seam. But again, you've got your fly spec carbon, but there's always pyrrhotite associated with it. And this is one of the outstanding things that has to be resolved in terms of pyrrhotite-pyrite phase relations. What went on here? This is a high-temperature phenomenon. Then there's this substance. Now, because this is a public talk, I'm not going to explain to you the texture applied to this, but if you have an imagination, you can. This is very common in the bits. As you go away from the carbon seam, these are two detrital quartz grains adjacent to each other. Up here is chlorite and this black stuff. And I want you to pay particular attention to this fellow here, this little thing here. But this is what it looks like in reflected light. The ends of that is gold, and the tail is chlorite. I want someone to explain to me how that forms. The solubility of gold is not in percents. So to get that amount of chlorite in there, carrying enough gold to precipitate at the end without a reaction rim around it of some kind, just doesn't do sense. Bear in mind the size here is 100 microns. There's a scale down the bottom. And that is this little thing down here. This looks like this. How did you get that little grain to shoot down? It looks like it's been shot in there. It's got these, and they are common in the Evander South Goldfield. We found lots of these things in the Kimberley Reefs. Now, what are those? So these are the phenomena. And then detail looking at the scene, we did a study of the carbon and we changed the name from mesophase. Of course, the word kerogen implies an insoluble, immobile, in situ organic matter. This is not organic matter. And this is what the seam looks like. These are a couple of photographs set together. There is the seam. Often it's cracked, or there's a vein associated with it. But notice these grains, this is a pebble that's been corroded by the seam and then it's opened. But the most important one, and the thin sections lying on my desk, is this particular one. Another one of these big thin sections, these 750 millimeter thin sections. Notice how the seam has ripped the top of this pebble. And this is what the bottom loop section looks like. It's opened up there. There it is here. Here's the carbon trying to force itself into the fracture. That is pyrrhotite. That's not pyrite. And that's what it looks like. Now, notice the striations in the quartz. Those are fluid inclusions. So a fluid has come through here. And if you look at it in cathode luminescence, set up for secondary quartz, in the plane of the carbon seam is this funny, it's often in the middle of the seam, there may be several of them, but the reason I'm using this one, this is 300 microns here, these are in a scanning electron microscope. Look what the secondary secondary quartz has done. It's torn open the seam, but it's a sharp boundary, but you don't see a clear fracture here. The rock is cracked, but there's no clear fracture. And you've got these funny little scaly bits of spalded primary quartz. But this carbon leader thin section you showed you earlier, we did it in the vicinity where there's no gold. Same thing in a scanning electron microscope. Here it is. This is a fracture. But this is we call this a pressure release fracture, where we take a piece of rock down from 3 kilometers down, it's got a zone of weakness in the carbon seam, and you release the pressure, it's going to crack. So I do not believe that that is a primary fracture. But this is what it looks like in a scanning electron microscope. This carbon seam, there's the carbon, but here's the gap. It just goes straight to quartz grains. That is not a placer. That is a 200 gram a ton sample that shoots right through the quartz grain. And look how thick that carbon seam is. Only it's less than 300 microns. That's your ore body. That is what you're going to mine. And look how it's, again, torn up these scales of primary quartz. This darker material is secondary quartz. And then we have this problem, again, working with a carbon needle. I thought these were orthogenic, these were apatite crystals. They're not. They're orthogenic zircons. This is a fluid inclusion train along here. And then once I discovered those zircons, we found hundreds of them. And we found their source. This is inside the carbon needle. This is the fluid pathway. There's gold inside here. There's uraninite. And this is this section over here magnified. And look, this fluid's come along here, corroded that zircon crystal and precipitated gold. And my question is, those of us who've tried, worked with, or seen them working with fine diamond analyses know that a really powerful solution of hydrofluoric acid will not dissolve zircon. What kind of acid solution was this to chow up a zircon and then just a few millimeters away form an orthogenic zircon? What kind of conditions existed in these rocks to do that? And that's what I don't understand. We put these in the probe. I worked with Richard Armstrong on this, and this is the remarkable thing. We couldn't date them. The date was impossible because look at the uranium content of these zircons versus the trityl zircons in the same rock. We have around about 100, just around 100 ppm uranium in the trityl zircon, and over 1,000 up to 3,000 parts per million uranium in the orthogenic zircon. There are no standards to date that. So what happens is problematical. But here's this is the first grain we dated, but this one's not going on a fluid inclusion chain. This is actually going on a quartz grain boundary. And this is the question I'm asking. How did this happen? What phenomena took place that could dissolve the trityl zircon and reprecipitate it a few centimeters away and maintain and generate a uranium-rich zircon? There's another example. Here's the fluid inclusion train. There are more of these. There's a whole little cluster of them. Why are they crystallized there and not equally along the grain? And this is what the Concordia diagram looks like. These things haven't crystallized yet according to this diagram. So we can't do anything with the data. It's an incompleted project. Anglo stopped funding it, and that's where it stopped. But this is a lovely piece of work for some PhD student. The next thing is I just quickly want to talk about the Valdez geochemistry. This is new data. This is the mine plan. Those red lines, where's my cursor? These red lines here are the raised lines. That's what we went underground and sampled. There is an outline of what they look like. There were sample profiles of 50 meters apart to 127 profiles with 1 to 12 samples per profile. So each profile is a set of samples up through the raised line. This is how we sample it. We would sample it. Here's the carbon seam. We would take samples that are lithologically controlled. The sampling was managed by a guy, Arvin Partha, who I'm still working with today. Arvin is a fine lad. He did a really good job of this. And there's a massive data here. And to show you that what we have here, this is a plot of uranium versus hafnium and selenium. Look at the hafnium and selenium levels in this thing, and they correlate perfectly. Now, what I'm going to do with this data, because I'm doing it very quickly, is the rare earth elements. Look at the rare earth profile. This is remarkable. It's related. This is the one. This is the champion. This is column 20 or S20. This is the high-grade carbon seam at 110 grams a ton, usually enriched in heavy rare earths. The rest of the profile is a normal sedimentary profile. This is another one that got lower levels. Now look at this abundance of rare earth relative to chondrite. This is quite high. Whereas this one, and the sediments here around about 200, yeah, they also start at 200 and go down, or a little bit lower, but this is a log plot. But again, the moment you put gold in, the more gold you got, the higher this is, and this is another example here. So what's going on? This is again, this is average shales, and there's a more. But if you look at rare earths for mantle, you get this kind of profile. You get various pyroxenites, xenoliths and klimbonites, you get this kind of profile. My question is there not possibly a mantle influence going on here? We need to look at that again. So then we need to look at the platinum group metals. And the important paper that came out by Louis Cabri, who I regard as the world's king of platinum mineralogy, in 2022 made two important points. Grains or nuggets of platinum iron alloys in places are always allogenic constituents and originate from primary magnetic crystallization, as is also the case of ruthenium, osmium, iridium alloys, and laurelite, ehrlichmanite, and spheroite. These are minerals that occur in the Wits. Growth of millimeter-sized crystals and nuggets has never been observed under ambient conditions, and proof of PGM neoformation to any significant degree is lacking. In other words, you can't form these kind of minerals hydrothermal and hydrothermal conditions very easily, not at low temperatures anyway. And the next thing I want to do is Clive Feather's PhD thesis. It's in my office, and it is a wealth of information. What he did was he took this is never going to happen again. No one's going to ever have access to this kind of sample. He sampled the heavy mineral concentrates from gravity concentration circuits of 10 gold mines in Anglo American Corporation. In addition, samples are obtained from various stages of gravity concentration and chemical cleaning on 2 of the mines. Approximately 80% of the platinum group minerals in the Witwatersrand conglomerates are iridium, osmium, ruthenium alloys. And they've got various types of minerals, but the platinum group minerals, in my view, this is my addition to this, what I took out of class thesis, they're really mentioned in Witwatersrand paragenetic studies. And if they are difficult to form under hydrothermal conditions, what do they do? What do they represent? And these are the minerals that Clive found. They are, and they were all formed during the process, according to him, of the Triton mineralization. Remember, this is 1976. And this is the list of them. There are 21 of them. And actually, in the subsequent paper, he actually go up to 25 of the fellows. But most of these are associated with a column on the absolute this column on the right. These are mostly associated with layered intrusions. This is the diagram he produced on the molecular microprobe composition, showing where they are. And there's all kinds of miscibility gaps, but this is a diagram, again, of Cabri's. And you can see it's rich in osmium. These platinum group minerals are enriched in osmium and iridium. Now, what happens is my Vaal-Reef Chem database, because now we move forward 30 years later, and what do we see? When we plot total PGMs against gold in PPB, these are PPB with gold, you go straight line. That indicates the chemical system, if that's gold's hydrothermal. If we plot box and whisker plots for each element of palladium, osmium, iridium, rhodium, ruthenium, and platinum, we find that they have got that the richest one is platinum, but ruthenium is actually not very abundant at all, and that's showed in Clive's diagram. In other words, that earlier triangular diagram I showed, that was the case as well. And these two are fairly substantial, relative to the platinum. The platinum relationship between osmium, iridium, and rubidium is much lower than in quite a lot of environments. And therefore, I'm saying that PGMs, the Wits suggest that mineral complexity has not been fully followed up. And the exact location of reefs, as well as their source and migration, needs to be investigated. How do they get there? Why do they correlate with gold? The system is more complex than just gold and alteration. There's much more to this. And I don't understand it. And that's why, when a couple of years ago, I was asked to log core at Athabasca, and I saw exactly the same things as I've seen in the Wits, and I discovered there's an impact in it. The only problem is that impact is older than the basin, according to modern data. I asked myself a question: what role did Vredefort play? And I'm looking at a paper that was produced in 2022 in the Journal of Geophysical Research by Natalie Allen, where they redid the mathematical modeling of the basin. to tie in with the contemporary ideas of the extent of the basin. But the point is, this is their photograph. This outer limit of planar deformation features, which is 45 kilometers, and the outer limit of shatter cones, which is 90 kilometers, that's a huge area. This is right to the edge of the goldfield. My point is, and we got pseudotachelites in the goldfield. What is the effect of this? And one of the things that's never taken into account is that the crust may be considerably thicker than or higher above us. In other words, a point there, it can be argued that anywhere between 5 and 9 kilometers of crust still above the rocks at that stage. We don't know. We don't know how thick the crust was that's just eroded away. But this is their model, and they essentially they found that in an impactor with a diameter of 25 kilometers, that's that 20 Table Mountains, impacting at 15 kilometers a second or bigger. The effect of that coming in at the speed of 50 to 70,000 kilometers a second. This is going to be coming in, an hour. This is going to create a monstrous impact. And these are the models. Now, I suggest people get hold of this paper and read it. And those are on our group who attended the talk of Matthew Huber earlier last year will remember this diagram. But the effect of this impact is huge. I'm not going to go into the details of the diagram, but what I just want to show is how monstrous this impact was. And the other thing that I want to look at again, and I want to do, is to look at the U238, U235 ratios in those orthogenic zircons. Those who have looked at Oklo, we had to look at Oklo. These are the average U238, U235 ratios of everything else, except for Oklo. That is what it is. It is only known, it's the only known reactor, natural reactor on Earth. And that's what the ratio is. All the others are around 137, 235 to, 238 to 235 ratios are about 137 to 1. This one's 139. And what I would like to do is to do some work on those orthogenic zircons to see what the ratio is. And did something go critical? So my closing remarks are, there's a conflict between modified platerists and hydrothermalists, and there's raised for eons. And I'm using a geological term there. The evidence for a modified placer or hydrothermal model is ambivalent and ambiguous. The fundamental hindrance to solving the conflict is the location of the gold in conglomerates. And when people say to me, but the gold's in conglomerates, it is a hindrance to actually resolving the conflict, the problem. And the relationship between gold and mineralized alteration is not unequivocal. And has the role of the field of impact been underestimated and not properly investigated? And the evidence for a catastrophic nuclear event may require an understanding of the distribution of U38, 235 ratios across the basin, based on the measurement focusing on minerals where the ratio would be stable. Remember, this is Archean we're dealing with. Oklo is not Archean. And decay rates may affect this ratio slightly. So one needs to look at that. And again, with the source of the gold and uranium, one guy saying it's deep in the basin, the next guy saying it's from the Upper Wits, others saying it's from the hinterland, the greenstone belts. We need that sorted out. Where did this gold come from? A lot of good work's being done, but I do believe that at some stage somebody needs to sit down and write a book where they take all this data and put it together. And it's not going to be one individual, it'll be lots, because we need to put a lot of minds there, including people that don't agree with each other. Because my final point is the origin of gold, bearing in mind its abundance, associations, location, stratigraphy, and structures, is still a mystery. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Keith. Guys, if you feel like some questions, please do raise up your hand or just unmute yourself and start talking.
Keith, first of all, for me, you've been promising for a long, long while about all this data, and you've really delivered today. It's been fantastic. Thank you. We actually wondered what was in your garage, and now we know probably 10% of what's there, but it's very, very valuable. And I think your message at the start of what an important resource this is for the country is one we should all think about, because to have this wasted or lost is criminal. I think I'll swing to Dave Young, because you've had one or two questions lined up. Do you want to start off with a question, Dave?
Yeah, I had the privilege to work on the VITs for JCI over a period of 20 years, doing lots of underground mapping. And I also found that there were carbon seams only associated in limited areas on mines. It was never ubiquitous, seemed to be everywhere. And secondly, I'd just like to ask about Frimmel. Has anybody, or has Frimmel's idea of a biogenic origin of gold been pursued, or has it lost sort of traction?
I guess I think of Frimmel as a classic placerist, if I can, in the terms of Pretorius and Minter and others. Yes, the story's changed of recent, but as a classic placer, I think Keith has pointed out, and many others have already, that there's a whole number of problems with that. If he's switching to a completely different story, then yes, we should examine it, but keep in mind, one of the great attractions of the placer model is that it's uniformitarianism, in that it matches things we see today. If that doesn't work, then we're sort of back to scratch. Anyone else want to add to that? Dave, do you have more to go on with?
I just like to say he had an idea that the gold could have formed about 3 billion years ago into a sort of a protor, and then was subsequently eroded and moved into the Vits sediments. And it was formed by a biogenic system revolving around the climate, the oxygen levels in the atmosphere at the time. Not the model that was promoted by Minter, that was like an algal mat. It was far more so sophisticated than that.
Can I come in there? There's a paper by Gary Gray, Steve, I mentioned earlier, Steve Lawrence, myself, and Chris Cornford, on the carbon, where we interpreted the carbon in terms of way it should be done with proper bioreflectance measurements. So a huge amount of work. It is definitely not biogenic. We've even located its origin in the shales. That paper, I suggest you read it. It's a paper that's not been cited much, and I think the amount of work that went into it was huge. My role in it was essentially instrument mechanic. That's why my name was on the paper, because all I did was purchase the microscope. But Gary Gray and Chris Cornford did the bulk of the work. And Chris Cornford, he passed away a few years ago. Probably one of the best oil geochemists that I've ever come across. This guy knew his work, and he was very particular in how he did this project. And it's very clear to us that the reflectance and bioreflectance data we got, that carbon is not biogenic.
Keith, could you add to a comment you made earlier about that, the hydrocarbons, and that when you said, I think you said, that could come from the shales from the Central Rand Group?
Yes.
Do you mean specific ones?
Boyson Shale being one.
Yep. Okay, well, that would certainly agree with what Jonathan Law published about in the mid-80s, yes, saying that. Yes. What about the ones in the lower bits, the Jeppy and things like that?
They were never ruled out.
Okay.
No shale that's close to mineralization was ever ruled out.
Yep. That's interesting. And I guess if they came out at that classic diagenetic stage, then they have subsequently been through metamorphism, which yes, means they've been cooked up to anthracite plus another 100 degrees.
Well, have you ever read that paper by Gray in I think it's the
yes, I have.
Geological Society publication?
Yes.
It was a huge amount of very, very high-level technical. We used a high-quality Zeiss microscope. I might add, I've got an identical model in my office with a really good quality reflectivity equipment fitted to it, and the standards were of impeccable quality. We were going to get it done in South Africa, but when Chris Cornford audited places they were not suitable. So we had to set it up and do it ourselves. And it was a huge amount of data. And again, being Anglo, with access to as much carbon seam material as we could do. The only problem was time. So it was pushed into, the project was pushed into a specific amount of time, and then we published it. I've got the full report behind me here on my desk.
Keith, what do you suggest we do with your things? Have you got your will written up?
No, nothing's written up. It's chaotic. I never write anything up. No, there's a lot of work to be done. And I've approached the Council of Geoscience. There's no issue with them. And what has happened is they and myself really haven't had the time to get together and start putting a formal project together. But I don't like doing it on my own. And I'm against putting the stuff in the university. It's my second alternative, because in just that university has access to it. At the council, and with the kind of people that are working at the council at the present time, it is likely that we can actually put a system in place where access to this legacy information is not only the bits, it's also Bushveld and everything else you've done, even the Beers information, should be in a central source. And the report's not buried. I mean, I wrote over 1,000 petrographic reports in my life. I don't know where most of them are. And I don't think anybody else does. And that's the problem. And lots of people, you know, every single, at the level that I worked at, produced the data. Over these reports probably stood 1.5 meters higher. I can only find 5. They've disappeared.
I would say,
to be found.
Yeah, Bjorn, you're in the audience here. How about you talk on behalf of the university of seconding students and people and directing people to come and help this guy get order in his life so that these things can then be passed on to a central organization?
Henny, thanks for reaching out. Yeah, I think, you know, it's a very valuable data set, as Keith has mentioned, and I think Neil also iterated. I'm completely open to it. You know, I think it can be shared in more than one place, right? So Keith mentioned that the value of the council is that it's open to everyone versus the university that only that university has it. But I think if you share with multiple universities, that would be great to have students working on.
Yeah,
We're always looking.
That's a good alternative as well, with multiple universities. But one of the things I had in mind after your talk last week, but I hadn't got through to doing it, was actually contacting you, and I'm going to do it this week. And I want to meet with you. So if I'm going to make some time, and I'll come across. I live in Hermanus, so that's not a problem. And I'll come across to Stellenbosch, and Neil as well. When next year out here, I'd like to get together with you and talk about a lot of things.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, let's take that conversation offline. I'm very, very eager to have it. Yeah. And yes, we should get Neil out here again.
I just want to make sure, you know, this thing doesn't get talked about, that we take some action. We can't think everybody else is going to do it. We've got to make a decision soon. And you guys, thanks for taking it up. And we're looking forward to getting some feedback from you in the near future.
Keith, just thinking about the large amount of data there, I would find it very formidable to know where to start. I like the idea of involving several people working together, and I think you're saying the same thing, and not making it private and confidential or anything. And I think one possibility might be to tackle specific issues, and one specific issue might be the hydrocarbon, come oil, come that story. But there's going to be a dozen other ones like that each person can contribute a bit to.
My feeling is that we've ignored things like the rare earths and platinum group elements, which also tell a story, because I think there's been not much work on it. And as it happened, a lot of things today, in many papers where people are focusing on ICP, laser ablation, collecting data. And the trouble is that data is fantastic. I'm not arguing against it, but it tends to be far too focused. And and one would like to look at the bulk nature of the rock, where there's little data. We've got, I mean, people like Sebastian Fuchs have done superb work, but a lot of it's, and also the guys at Coase was laser ablation ICP. And it's good stuff, and there's a lot of ideas that I have using it, but the thing is to understand what the bulk system has done, because that is what it really is. It's the structures and the control of the mineralization and the order those elements came in at. What stage was the uranium only in the system ever? Was there a stage only when there was only just gold in the system? What are the platinum? I mean, platinums are not that kind of hydrothermal element, form hydrothermal minerals readily, but there's a hell of a lot of platinum for a sedimentary deposit in those rocks, and we've never actually understood it or worked at it. Everyone just says it's a placer, but why does a mineral that is strongly associated with placer occur in a gold deposit that we think is hydrothermal and concentrated, and obviously hydrothermal?
And I think
I would like to.
Sorry, carry on, Neil.
I was just going to say, at this stage, I'd like to sort of widen this to anybody who's got other questions on oil, other questions on platinum elements, anything else you want to bring up and flag as a point, or to ask Keith his opinions. Derek Shaw. That's not a question. Damn good question, Keith. What are the dates and times of extra talks? While you think about that, let me answer Dave's, which is next Tuesday and next Thursday. That's twice in the week. We'll be meeting at 10 a.m. South African time. That's Spike McCarthy on Tuesday, Graham Gaveen, and a discussion session on the Thursday. That Thursday is the day before Good Friday, I believe. Happy if you. I've already put up a few little questions at the start of this talk today, so send through things during the week if you think something's of interest. Sorry, now carry on. Questions for Keith.
Is Spike in the audience?
I didn't see him.
Spike is in the audience. He is sitting in my living room, and so he is available for comments if you'd like to ask him anything.
I just want him to send me a quick resume, or not so much resume, but just some teasers that I can put in out on reminders for his talk next week.
Yeah, will do.
Thank you very much.
Keith, a question from Mark Goodhart saying, why do you think the gold is in the conglomerate?
That is a question that has puzzled me. And that is the problem with the hydrothermal story, is that this gold is in the conglomerates. My answer to that is the fact that, and I didn't put the thin section photograph in, I should have, is that if you'd ask me what mineral is associated with the gold alteration, I will tell you quartz, because most of the reefs are highly silicified, and the mineralization is along the bottom of that plane normally, and that is a fracture or something so you've got a competency contrast between the silicified reef and the footwall, which in many instances in the Vaal Reef is quite rich in porphyroite. There's actually, in some of the southern sections I've got, there's a radical difference in the alteration mineralogy of the footwall and the reef. One is quartz and the other is porphyroite, cerussite. And that, I believe that if you'd ask me, does that alteration mineralogy play a role? I'll say yes, it does, but structurally, not chemically. It's a competency contrasting. We can clearly see it. And I showed you the one picture now where that carbon seam passes into the footwall in the carbonite and comes out again at the microscope scope. We see it also at the macroscope. If you follow that seam along and look very closely, but it definitely lives at the base of the conglomerate. For what reason, I don't know. And why I picked on conglomerates, there are lots of rocks in that Wits that where there's a competency contrast and there's not a change in grain size, but there's no gold there. There's no mineralization. Why I chose the conglomerates is another problem. If it's hydrothermal, why did it happen like that?
A question from me then, while we wait. Can you, I mean, we can obviously think of lots of gold reefs that aren't in conglomerate. There's quite a few important ones there. What about gold reefs that aren't related to unconformities in the Wits?
Well, again, what is an unconformity is an issue that came up a lot. We had a huge row because an angle of dip of 1 degree is not an unconformity in the footwall. That to me was not. I did not see an unconformity of really any significance. And so in some places, yes, there is a definite unconformity. In others, there's not. I actually, I'm not too sure. Again, working with many of the traditional sedimentologists, they seem to be controlled. I'm talking in the environment, in the corporate environment. They seem to be almost controlled by herd mentality. I've had huge arguments underground with sedimentologists saying I do not see an unconformity here. The angle of dip of the sediments below the conglomerate is not all that great. As soon as there's a conglomerate there is an unconformity there in all cases. In some cases, yes, there is. In some cases, I've not seen a proper unconformity. Again, it's related to where you're going to get a fracture.
Doesn't have to
get a fracture. That is what the basin analysis study clearly showed that.
Still in that. Put your hand up until
You tell them.
Okay, I'm just going to draw attention to some, unless Julian wants to do it himself. But,
can you hear me, Neil? Spike, yeah.
Yes, Mike, go ahead.
Look at angular. An unconformity doesn't necessarily imply an angular disconformity. It can be a completely planar surface. All it would represent is a break in time. So it can have a completely flat surface.
Yeah, I know. I have no problem with that. No problem with that.
So why not? I mean, you can have all kinds of.
We could not agree to how long the break in time was. That was the big thing.
We'll never know that. We'll never know that, obviously.
Yeah, that's the big thing. I don't have a problem with that point, Spike, at all.
Yeah. Okay.
Julian's got a question. Julian Vernkamp's got a question in the chat, or actually an important statement that Geoscience Australia and Andy Barnacote performed the petroleum basin type analysis, and there's a PowerPoint that's widely available, and he thinks that Andy would happily share that. Keith might be part of that, but it's certainly the same group that Keith's been talking about, a very valuable thing to look at for those interested in that whole petroleum carbon.
Yeah, quite a lot of stuff. Andy's another person that I've got a lot of the stuff that they did, but there's a lot missing, and I'd like to know how much Andy still has, because I think he and I need to sit down and again and re-look at the paper we wrote in 1996. They've been cited a lot, but I'm sure it could be updated.
Okay.
I'll talk to Andy. I've got a workshop with him on the 28th. I'll talk to him.
Okay. Dave Young, do you want to mention that about the reactivation? It's in the chat there. In my career, I noticed many times the gold is based on reactivation surfaces, not necessarily unconformities.
Yeah, this is not based on, it's all macro observations of mapping many stope faces, and you can have conglomerates up to 5 or 6 meters thick. And the gold is actually associated macroscopically on reactivation surfaces, that sort of minor breaks in the sedimentation within the conglomerates. They needn't necessarily be on an unconformity, but although on a macro scale, the reefs generally do form an unconformity in relation to older sediments, and you can actually get some. And what appeared to me many times is that the footwall to a sediment, a stratigraphic break, is related to the footwall rocks being partially diagenous, a lot harder, and there was sort of, a lot of
competency contrast.
Competency contrast, yeah, in it, and you can actually get actually blocky type contacts.
Folks, can Grant Cawthorne mention something? Keith,
go ahead.
Very, very obligingly and kindly mentioned my name twice. I have never done anything on the Wits, and Keith's credit is not deserved. Thank you, folks.
It's Dave Howcroft here. Can I put in a word?
Go ahead, Dave.
Looking at placer and the other methods, hydrothermal, for getting the gold in place and why the gold is sitting in the conglomerates. If any of the geologists considered the sort of extraterrestrial impacts that could vaporize the gold and let the gold come tumbling down with ejecta to form the conglomerates with tiny particles of gold in it?
You can handle that one, Keith.
Well, the problem is that the impact, first of all, the impact, the current modeling shows that there must have been a layer, a fairly thick layer of total molten rock above the Wits Basin, which is completely eroded away. What we're seeing now is the bottom of the impact. So whatever got in there, as a result, the impact would have got in there via fractures or anything that developed subsequent to impact. I don't think that the impact itself would have generated a deposit. I don't see it. What it could have done, though, was generated some kind of fission, nuclear fission, because if there's a huge amount of uranium in the basin, and if there'd been ponding of uranium at any level in the mantle, that could have gone critical with an impact like that. And one needs to look at what generated the only known natural reactor, which is Oklo in Gabon. Compare that and see if there are any artifacts in the Wits that show that. One of the things I find very interesting is the fracture pattern around the carbon seam is very similar in the carbonita, around the carbon seam of the carbonita, and some parts of it is very similar to the fracture pattern that the event at Oklo generated. I don't know how good it is, because my only Oklo thin section, like a lot of my thin sections, has disappeared. I had 2 thin sections of Oklo mineralization, and I tried finding it because it's still quite radioactive, but I used a scintillation counter to look for it in my cupboard, but I couldn't find it. But I've lost those 2 thin sections. But I have pictures taken by other people in the papers, and there's some quite interesting things. And bear in mind that Oklo also has uranium plus carbon mineralization.
Okay, that's interesting. And the other thing about the impact cause of gold's microparticles is, if you go up to Zimbabwe, which not many people go up there nowadays, but I've spent some time with the miners who are mining various rivers and even open countryside, that the gold particles are very close to the surface, and they just dig them up and pan them, or put them over a carpet and run water over them, run the mud over there to extract the gold. So now we're looking at the gold particles in a very consistent reef in South Africa with Vredefort. But if you look at Great Dyke, you get the same thing, is that the platinum and chrome and vanadium, all of those things stayed in the ground and went a long distance, whereas the gold appears to have vaporized and then precipitated down onto the ground again.
The trouble with that idea is, remember that the Wits consists of a series of reefs that are mineralized. You're talking about mineralization over 500 million years, from the Dominion all the way through the lower Wits, through the upper Wits, where it's mineable and economic, all the way into the Black Reef, which is part of the Transvaal. So you've got those series of mineralized reefs all the way up. So they were never exposed to the surface during a single impact. That single impact would only mineralized one layer. We've got lots of reefs all the way through the system.
Yes, I appreciate that. And what are your thoughts on all of those reefs together being lifted up by the explosion, the underground explosion from the meteorite.
No evidence of that in the rocks. There's no fracturing or the photographs I showed of the carbon needle coming in, the damage is actually quite benign. An impact would have had a huge effect. There's no evidence of that ore body being the result of impact.
Don't say what a great contribution it was. No,
okay. Keith, a different question following up the PGEs you mentioned, and I'll swing to Evander and mention a paper by Spike and Co. I think out earlier this year. Well worth getting for people interested in it. Evander's the only goldfield that produces economic platinum, to the best of my knowledge, and it's the only goldfield that does not produce uranium. Have you got any comment sort of on the negative correlation there?
Western Holdings has got lots of uranium. It's also produced platinum in the Free State.
So say where?
Western Holdings in the Free State has a history of producing platinum, not platinum, but one of the other, I think it was iridium in the Free State, or osmium.
Oh, okay.
One of those two we've produced at Western Holdings.
All right, well, I'll rephrase my question slightly by saying that the concentrations in Evander are 10 times what they are in Western Holdings and Driefontein.
Yeah, I agree.
And
the point, it's an important point you bring up, Neil, because Clive Feather's thesis only focused on the Anglo mines. Bear in mind, Anglo owned most of the mines, but they never owned the Evander mines. So that data is missing from Clive's thesis. And it'd be very interesting to put a project aside to repeat the work that he did in Evander and take it further with modern ICP, laser ablation technology, and see what comes out of that. I think that'd be quite an interesting thesis for someone to
do. The numbers for all the mines are published, but they are old, and it's Cousins, and then followed up by...
Yes, I've got the paper here behind me. I must have a look at that paper.
That could definitely be done again. It's it could be 50 years old, but it's very clear that the Evander one.
A lot of the old assay data is problematic because they never used an instrument finish. They used a gravity finish, which is not as sensitive. So your lower levels of detection are very spotty. So one needs to redo that using modern analytical technology, and that's what's going to give us the answer to many of these problems. Because I don't think one could, particularly platinum and also the gold data. The old assay data was not good.
Right. Do we have any further questions? Because if not, I'm going to first of all mention next week, Tuesday, 10 o'clock South African time, and Thursday, 10 o'clock South African time, which will finish off our series of 8 or 9. If you want to go and see any of the older